Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back with episode number 76 as we continue counting down our 100 favorite movies of all time. John is having some web browser issues, so he keeps kind of popping in and popping out. I don't know if he's going to be able to end up lasting or if he's going to end up just getting kicked out over and over again. But today we enter the top 25. And so if you're listening, you're not watching, and you are mid-John sentence and you're like, why did Phil just start speaking? It's because John cut out and his browser stopped working. John, how's it going? And what's up with your browser, bro?
It's going pretty well. I mean, it's October. It's like my favorite movie viewing month of every year. I don't know what's going on with the browser. I hopefully found a solution to it so we don't have to worry about that anymore.
Let's hope. Got my fingers and toes crossed. So we'll see what ends up happening. Today, though, we're talking about Planet of the Apes, and we're talking about Birdman, the Planet of the Apes from 1968, Birdman from 2014, obviously the best picture winner from Inarritu. Planet of the Apes, though, John, we just got big news on Planet of the Apes. They're continuing the original, not the original trilogy, this remake trilogy. So pretty much the Planet of the Apes, the way it works is there were 5 movies. 3 of them, like one of them is a classic. 2 of them are like pretty good. 2 of them are really bad. Then Tim Burton made a movie that we pretend never happened. It pretty much made it known that Tim Burton could be the worst director in Hollywood history. Just because of that one movie. It's so bad. It is horrific, whatever. And then they kind of made these like prequels to Rise of the Planet of the Apes and all that. And those movies were very surprisingly good. And they just kept getting better as more and more budget actually went into them. And now we're getting a 4th in that line. We don't really know what it entails, but I'm hoping that it actually is a newer version of the 1968 classic, because the 1968 classic is number 25 on my top 100. And there's really no reason they shouldn't be able to make an absolute masterpiece, new school, out of this movie with everything that this movie offers. So, yeah, that was cool news. John actually brought it up to me. John, did you see anything else about it, or am I right? That's like really all we know.
I think like one of the leads from the Netflix Witcher series is in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like the female lead from it or something like that. But that's about all we know right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm hopeful that it'll end up being a like a real like remake, or not even a remake, but just a continuation in some way. If you remember in the first one of the new trilogy, there is a scene where the rocket ship takes off and goes into space, kind of signaling like, hey, here's the rocket ship. I don't know if they're going to jump that far ahead. I don't know if they want to touch the original. Everybody's been really positive on those 3 movies. So maybe they don't want to like lose the good graces, considering, the reputation of Tim Burton's is so bad. But anyway, this is the 1968 version. Let's talk about that one first and then jump into Birdman second. The 1968 version, this is my like childhood movie. This is the movie that's on my list that makes this list because a lot of nostalgia. There's no doubt in my mind that this is a phenomenal movie, that it's a great movie, that it's like one of the all-time greats, especially of the genre. I think it really is top-notch. But gets into my top 25 because of the nostalgia factor, because of all of that. This is a movie I was watching when I was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Like as a kid, you're just watching this movie, and it's such a good movie. It's just a really cool concept. And the book that this was based on is about a planet of apes that is so far advanced beyond what human beings are. Now, they didn't have the budget for that in 1968, which is the same year that Space Odyssey comes out. And Space Odyssey, you're with Kubrick and all that. This movie is Franklin J. Schaffner. Like, who? Yeah. What? Who's that? It's him. It's Charlton Heston, kind of getting close to the end of his career there. Roddy McDowall towards the end of his career. Kim Hunter towards the end of her career. And by end of their career, I mean like they're past their glory days. Kim Hunter won for Streetcar Named Desire in the 50s. Roddy McDowall was in How Green Was Your Valley in the 40s. Charlton Heston coming off of Ben-Hur and all that stuff in the 50s. Now it's 1968. It's a little bit later. And what they did was they were able to really focus in on just what society kind of was and make it a movie about racism and classism and exploration and humanity and like the immortality of man and all of that fun stuff, and make it about an astronaut who lands on what he thinks is a different planet that's run by apes, and have this epic ending. Of course, Rod Serling comes up with that. That's not in the book, to make it that like they just landed back on Earth and this is what ended up happening. So many great lines in this movie, though. Really great acting. And John Chambers literally changed the game of makeup with this movie. John Chambers makeup won, I think, an honorary Oscar for this, if I'm not mistaken. But the makeup design in this movie just like changed the game. It is so ridiculous what he does with their faces. And how he gets the things to move and all that. If you ever watch a behind the scenes of making of this movie, it's crazy what these actors and stuff had to go through. And yeah, obviously the CGI apes look more like apes nowadays, but to make it back in the 60s when you didn't have that technology and you're doing all in-camera effects and make it seem like, you know what, maybe this is how apes evolved. Now they're standing up more straight and more human, and they've evolved to this level. It's pretty ridiculous. But anyway, John, this is the first time you watched it. What'd you think?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of one of those like blank spots in my sci-fi repertoire that it's been a movie I've been meaning to get to for a while, and I just hadn't gotten around to it. And I really enjoyed it. It's so different than the science fiction movies we were talking about last week. It's not that highbrow sci-fi that, you know, Arrival, Interstellar, even 2001: A Space Odyssey is. This feels like the type of science fiction movie that comes out of the wake of Star Trek, right? Mm-hmm. It's coming 2 years off of the start of the original series, and it feels like it. It feels more like this sci-fi TV show. It has a lot more of these underlying themes that we did see in Star Trek with like the civil rights movement and racism, things like that. But in the end, like, this is just a really fun movie.
Mm-hmm. This was so after my honeymoon, John, when I was hospitalized and had all that fun stuff going on, this was one of the first movies that when I got back out of the hospital, I sat down and watched, because this movie just really is like, it is just a fun movie. It's fun, but there's a depth to it too that you don't necessarily see in these types of sci-fi movies. Like if you watch the Tim Burton one, there's no depth to that movie at all. Like the characters are one note. It's terrible, whatever. There's a depth to this. They're trying to state something about, you have the chimpanzees and the orangutans and the gorillas and where they fit into this society, how they all dress the same. And like, we're that far advanced, and how they treat the humans, but it's kind of like humans, how they treat, animals and other people and whatever. And this, coming on the heels of the civil rights movements and everything like that. This is very much talking about that kind of stuff that was going on in America. But then it has the excitement of like an exploration space adventure movie that it's relatable in so many different ways. And I just think it's one of the most fun movies, because obviously I've seen this movie a million times since I was a child. So, it's hard to get out of the mindset of, we all know the ending, especially when I have the DVD and I should have kept it next to me, because the front cover is the Statue of Liberty and the back is the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is on both. So they're assuming if you're buying the Planet of the Apes, you know what happens in this movie. But prior to that reveal, the way they're setting this up, where Dr. Zaius the whole time so clearly is hiding something. And it does feel so much, this is a statement on religion. It's the sacred texts and all of that. And it's been passed down that you can't go into the forbidden zone. Well, why can't you go into the forbidden zone? Because you're going to learn that apes aren't the ones who were always in control. And that's what they don't want to have happen. And it's that whole thing with religion and the earth is round versus flat versus what do we revolve, or do we revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around us? All of those things. There's so much to that. And with Zaius going through that, and with the reveal of the doll at the end, that it can speak, that it's saying mama and all that, but you still don't know it's on Earth. You just know, okay, maybe there was a human type creature. And then you find out it was Earth, and it's like, whatever, 2,000 years in the future or something like that. It's just such a cool concept. It's so much fun. And yeah, I mean, it's a movie I just literally never get tired of.
The twist was so interesting, because obviously, like, I'm 30 years old. I like movies. I obviously know the ending of Planet of the Apes. So watching it the first time, I was a bit nervous. I was a bit nervous that knowing how this movie ends would kind of ruin it. I talked about that with previous movies we've discussed on the podcast. Yeah, how the twist kind of like ruined it for me. And I don't think it does with Planet of the Apes. And I think it's a lot of because they really set it up fairly well. where we know they're in the future. It's immediately established that they have been traveling through time, essentially.
Mhm.
And despite the fact that we see them crash, we knew they were supposed to land on Earth. Like, we knew that's where they were supposed to end up. And yes, everything's alien. There are apes running around, ruling the place. But it's still, the planet never feels very alien at the same time. Where it's like, yes, we get like these deserts and stuff. But like, again, those are, while they're the weirder aspects of the world, they're still places in the world.
Yeah.
So it's never taken to a point where it's a shocker twist, where it's like, oh yes, but did you know they were on Earth the entire time? It kind of, and I think it really works because of Taylor's characterization throughout the entire movie. I've just been so like holier than thou and so righteous the entire time that when he spouts off that they're on this distant planet in this distant solar system, you're just like, yeah, okay, sure. And then you're like, is he just telling himself that? Because he doesn't want to believe this is Earth.
And it's because something malfunctioned with that ship. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. Something malfunctioned where they weren't supposed to be asleep as long as they were asleep for. And whatever malfunctioned, that's why he doesn't believe that they ended up on Earth. What I also love about this, though, is the concept that, yeah, it's the desert, but by planting the Statue of Liberty, one of the most iconic monuments in the world, that the Eiffel Tower, like, you know, maybe Big Ben, like those kinds of things, one of the most iconic things in the world. You know, wait, where did New York City go? They blew it up. And that's why nothing can survive in the Forbidden Zone, because it's like a nuclear wasteland. Now, the second one, see, it's funny because the second one has a lot of good ideas. It just doesn't pull it off in the same way that the first one does. But the second one has a lot of interesting ideas with human beings who are able to talk, but they live underground in the Forbidden Zone, and they're trying to build a nuclear warhead so that they can blow up. Like, it has good ideas. No, I'm serious. It has good ideas. However, the problem is it's just not executed that well. But it builds on this whole, like, Taylor goes missing in the Forbidden Zone and like what's going to happen. And, you know, you have lines in there about they will dissect you, then they will kill you, in that order, and like all that stuff. And like, there's so many great moments in the second one, but it's not a great movie. That's why, though, I think it'd be so interesting to see these people who made the original trilogy continue moving forward and make something out of this original. I'm not talking, not the original trilogy, the remake trilogy. Yeah, but go and like actually pull from these first 5 movies, because it's almost like when they made this movie, they were just focused on, we landed on a planet, here's your setting, here's your characters, here's what we're doing, here's your apes, like all of that, and now we have the ending. The second one and the first one, if you combine the best elements of both, you have like the ultimate perfect movie. Because the second one had a lot of really good ideas, but you would have had to extend beyond what this first movie does, which completely ruins the end and everything like that. And then the reveal has to come earlier. Now they can do that, though, when they go to make the new Planet of the Apes, because everybody already knows the twist ending, that they're on Earth. So rather than have the movie end with that, you use that as your midway point, and then you get into the mole people and the nuclear warhead and all this stuff that's going on that the apes don't know about. And, you know, like a version of humanity that's still evolved, that's more evolved than the people that Taylor and his people run into on this planet. So anyway, just all of that, like, there's a lot of good science fiction ideas in this series. The first one's really the only one that's like worth its weight, but there's still a lot of good ideas throughout.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned like this idea of like extending this prequel trilogy to kind of cover these ideas that they had in the original series, including the TV show. There was a TV show for Planet of the Apes, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
And like they've already made nods to these other Planet of the Apes movies anyways, with the inclusion of Caesar as the main character in this prequel trilogy, because Caesar is the son of the characters in this movie, right?
Yeah.
Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, Caesar is the son of Zira and Cornelius.
Yeah. So they've made the hints at it. And one of my big complaints when this prequel trilogy, and why it took me so long to watch the prequel trilogy, like the first movie of the prequel trilogy when it came out, was because I was like, how do you make a prequel to a movie that has one of the greatest twists in cinema history? And like that's where I think the prequel trilogy excels, is because it was able to handle this twist in a way where it doesn't feel like it's taking away, despite the fact that it is this well-known twist that everyone knows about. And I think that's all just based on the groundwork laid in this film. And it's because you can take these very small details that they put in this original film and expand on them. The differentiation between like the monkey apes, the gorilla apes, and the orangutan apes is so subtle, but so unique at the same time. And it's so, you can see the hierarchy within the society based on the way that these different characters look. And like, and that's where we get into this discussion of race and the civil rights movement. I mean, this movie came out in '68. We're in the heart of the civil rights movement at this time. And it's really interesting if you look at, there are a lot of critiques of this movie, because there's a big question of whether or not this movie is, it obviously has these ideas of the civil rights movement and pushing forward for, you know, understanding of the way that society was during the late 60s, and quite frankly still is a lot of places. But the question kind of remains, is this movie racist because it's comparing like non-white people to animals?
See, and I don't think it is, because it's comparing everybody in humanity to animals. Like it's comparing.
I agree.
Like it's comparing all of them. So like that's where it's like one of those things where these movies are very much, yes, there's the racism and like the classism and all of that going on. But I think the big thing with this movie is you're not told specifically one way or the other. You're just pretty much told the orangutans, they're the knowledgeable ones. The chimpanzees are the inquisitive ones, and the gorillas are the brute ones, which is kind of how those animals are in general. So then anything that you're kind of pulling from that as, I think, a nod to society, I think is really just more of like inherent kind of racism in humanity as it is. Like if that makes
exactly
sense.
I agree. And I think that's kind of where the brilliance of this movie, and quite frankly a lot of these like lower budget sci-fi films of the late 60s go, and just like where science fiction was going at this time. Especially, I mean, we've talked about it already, right? This film was adapted by Rod Serling, who, for those who don't know, is like the mastermind behind the Twilight Zone, which always dealt with these type of things.
Yep.
And when you're seeing this, it's just so hypercritical of American society, and the fact that it still resonates so well today just kind of shows how ageless this movie is, despite the fact that, yes, it's corny. There are some corny aspects to this film.
And we're going to talk about those. That makes it gold, baby. It's 1960s sci-fi. It's B movie. I love it.
Well, and that's the best part. That was the best part. Like sitting down and watching it is like, this feels so 60s sci-fi. We're starting with, you know, Charlton Heston's voiceover at the beginning, like giving us the rundown. It's
smoking a cigar in a spaceship, by the way.
Yeah, and it's just like, it feels like a Kirk entry at the beginning of an episode of Star Trek, right? Like you can tell where those like the Gene Roddenberry influences are in this film. And you have these, the crash sequence in this film is phenomenal. Like not only do we get these gorgeous aerial shots, but they're just going all over the place and crazy the entire time. It feels so low budget 60s science fiction. And I just feel like we've really lost a very valuable part of science fiction as a whole by not getting these type of low budget science fiction movies anymore. When I was growing up, there was this film that I've watched it a few times. It's a very bad movie. It's called Teenagers from Outer Space. Have you ever heard of it, Phil?
I have not.
Okay. It's essentially exactly what it sounds like. These aliens like crash on Earth and stuff, and it's this alien race is looking for a place to raise the Gorgon there, which is like this livestock that they have essentially. Essentially, it's a giant lobster. And it's you get to the end of the film, and the way they depict this monster in like the climax of this film is the shadow of a lobster. And like that's this part of like this 50s, 60s sci-fi that we don't have anymore. We miss that heart of the corny cheesiness. We get it in some things, right? Like we get science fiction B movies still, but like they don't feel like this like kooky practicalness that a movie like Planet of the Apes embodies so well.
Yeah, well, because you know what the thing is, like those B movies are so fun to make fun of, for sure. I mean, like, so at Hollywood Studios and Disney World, they have the sci-fi dine-in theater where you sit down in like a stylized car and you eat your burgers or your chicken wings or whatever, and they have a screen. They have it all dark in there, and they have a screen in front that just plays clips of B movies, and like as if you're in a drive-in movie. It's so hard to get reservations for that restaurant, and the food isn't very good. The reason, because there's a comfort to that. There's a fun to that. There's something so enjoyable about that. It's why people sit down and watch Mystery Science Theater 3000. I hate to break it to everybody. Those guys aren't that funny. They make some great lines, but if you think about an hour and a half episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000, you probably laugh at about 30 of their jokes. You're going to laugh pretty hard at some of those, but there's so many throwaway lines where you're like, oh, cool. They're just like saying something. But you still sit there and watch it despite the fact that that movie is awful, because there's something so entertaining about watching something awful. To me, and this is how I always describe Planet of the Apes, it's the greatest B movie ever made because it had all the elements of B movies, and then it had Charlton Heston, Kim Hunter, Rod Serling writing it, Roddy McDowall, Maurice Evans, who plays Dr. Zaius, is absolutely phenomenal. You had great direction and cinematography behind everything. You had a great concept that is actually dived into properly. And that's what sets this one apart from other B movies. To me, this is still a B movie. It doesn't have the budget, but they had John Chambers come in and do the makeup so that you really saw there's no real villain in this movie. There's no real hero in this movie. But you see the apes the entire time, and you see what they're doing. Now, you talked about the corniness. Monkey see, human do. Great line. Never gets old. Literally never gets old. The part where they are having Taylor on trial, and the three apes are sitting there. One's got his ears covered, one's got his eyes covered, and the other has his mouth covered. Brilliant. Like, it's so stupid. Don't get me wrong. It's so corny. But I love that this movie leans in to taking itself very seriously and then still manages to have those moments. One of my favorite lines in movie history ever, I think it's so funny, is when Kim Hunter, Zira, just looks at Charlton Heston and says, "But you're so damned ugly." Like, that is one of the funniest lines I think ever, because it's just like, that's where this movie was at. We have an ape telling Charlton Heston how ugly he is, and I can't wait to see how this movie is going to conclude. That's what other B movies don't have that Planet of the Apes had. And I think it's just Rod Serling. If you think about Twilight Zone, a lot of B movie elements to the Twilight. A lot of corniness, a lot of whatever going on. But it makes you feel good. You want to keep watching it, and it blows your mind more often than it doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. It's this enjoyment, and it's the fact that you can delight in that corniness with, like you said, like there's so many just like serious topics at play in this film. I love the idea of this ape society being this theocracy. And the fact that they're just like, but the ancient text says we can't do this. And it's like, and the reason why that's so compelling in this is because the main characters we are introduced to in ape society are scientists.
Yep.
It's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. And that's what this movie's questioning. It's like, okay, what are we talking about? Like science versus religion and stuff. And it's showing how religion is kind of obscuring the way science can progress. The scene where like we find out about like the lobotomies that they're conducting on the humans to like study their brains and stuff. It's like, oh, that's some serious like ethical questions we have here now on the experimentation of these people. Like, what's going on? And then there's that joke of a trial.
Yeah.
Where it's literally a show trial where it's like they made their decision and it comes up in conversation where they're like, he has no rights under ape law. And then it's like, if he has no rights under ape law, how is he on trial?
Well, and that's, you were asking the question before, is it bad because you're considering you're comparing non-white people to animals? Charlton Heston is put on trial as if he was a black man in the 1800s. He's not, he doesn't have rights under our stuff. Okay, but so why is there even a trial? Well, it's already been determined. Like, that's what this was back during the 2/3 compromise and all of those things. And the trial, think about through history, John. Like, granted, we actually can see such a small portion of history because we can only really witness about 100 years of history. And then everything else is through texts and all of that. Not saying that that's not accurate. It's just, we can't see that. Think about all these trials throughout the time of history, whether it's Joan of Arc, whether it's the Salem witch trials, whether it's Galileo, and I don't even know if he ever went on trial, but he obviously was not popular for his beliefs.
Yeah.
All of that. And then it's coming out in Planet of the Apes. Like, those were all real things that were happening. It's just appalling to witness now. But in 1968, there were still people who were being put on trial in a very similar situation to the way Charlton Heston was being put on trial. As Bob Dylan says in his song, The Hurricane, and the all-white jury agreed. Like, that happens back in the 60s. That was happening a lot. But
it's still happening. Like, that's still today's society, right? Like,
and then you get to lobotomies. You were talking about that. There's all these trials and things, whether it's on animals or humans who are terminally ill or might become terminally ill, and you see that all the time. Mental patients back in the 60s, back in the 50s, back during this era, they were getting lobotomies. I mean, remember, 7 years after this movie is when One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out. And One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is all about how bad these mental institutions were and what they would do to people if they couldn't control them. And Zaius knew that if Taylor was ever able to meet up with this person and they could both speak, then all of a sudden he has no credibility anymore. So what does he do? He performs the lobotomy. And what's he trying to do to Taylor? He's trying to perform the lobotomy. That's what I mean, though, by the depth of this movie. Yeah. Find me another B movie that has that. It's hard to do. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the original one, absolutely has that. But it's so few and far between with these types of movies. And I think that's why Planet of the Apes stands up as a classic and has been remade or continues to have TV shows or whatever that just grow off of it. Everybody knows Planet of the Apes.
Yeah, it just has this lasting legacy. And it's really interesting because it's especially interesting now because Planet of the Apes wasn't really widely available until Disney Plus came along. But now that Disney Plus has every single Planet of the Apes movie on it, this is a movie that is so accessible to everyone. And
we don't have it on Disney Plus here.
Oh, really? We do in Canada.
Yeah, not in America. I have the DVDs, so I had to watch it that way. It's not streaming on anything here. It was on HBO Max for a while, but they got rid of it.
Interesting. Well, in Canada, we have all of the Planet of the Apes movies on Disney Plus, and they're so accessible. And it's kind of we saw this resurgence of Star Trek when the J.J. Abrams Star Trek trilogy started. And I feel like we didn't get this resurgence of Planet of the Apes when the Planet of the Apes trilogy started. And it's kind of a shame because this movie is just so iconic. I mean, it's parodied in The Simpsons. It's parodied in everything.
Everything.
But I will always remember Troy McClure in the Planet of the Apes musical in The Simpsons. And it's so iconic. It's just such an important piece of cinema history that everyone needs to watch at some point.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why it didn't get such a renaissance is because it is dated in elements, the pew pew at the end of the movie when they're shooting at each other, all that stuff.
It's perfect.
I love that stuff, but you have to really have a taste for that. If you're sitting down to watch it and you're like, what is this? It's kind of like watching an old 50s or 60s Western. You're not going to appreciate a movie like Shane or The Searchers the same way as somebody who actually really likes that style. But this movie has the two lines of "It's a madhouse" and "Get your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape," which I probably I would reiterate all the time when I was a child. I had watched this movie, and my parents, my mom and grandma, they always tell the story. They were walking me down the boardwalk, and they were walking me. I was 4 years old. And I just kept muttering something every time somebody would walk by me. And they were like, what is he saying? What is he saying? So finally they stopped the stroll and they said, what are you saying? And I was saying, get your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape. To everybody who walked past me. Everybody who walked by me.
So funny.
Yeah. So, but like, that's how much of an impact this movie has had on my life. Like those lines, everything like that. I can quote the second one just as well as I can quote the first one. And the first one I can quote pretty damn well when he's talking to him, when he's talking to what do you call it, Nova, and like you know all the things about her, and when Cornelius is kind of battling with Zira over what they believe with Taylor, like that to me is like dialogue that is just so phenomenal, and I appreciate so much. And this movie, John, has the greatest laugh in the history of film when Taylor turns around and sees whatever, I forget what his name is, I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, but he's planting the flag. And he starts laughing, and Charlton Heston's face isn't even moving, and they do the cut to like above the mountains, and it just keeps going, ha, 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 and it just keeps, it's the greatest laugh in movie history. Charlton Heston, one of the biggest hams in cinematic history, and yet so entertaining. It's hard to find a bad Charlton Heston movie. Charlton Heston movies are very, very entertaining, and I don't care what anybody says, he is not a very good actor.
Oh, he's a terrible actor.
Yeah.
He's so bad, but he's so perfect for this film, though. Right? Like,
he was really perfect for the era. That was the thing.
Yeah, exactly. And every aspect of this film is just so enjoyable. The set design's phenomenal. I love the fact that the set design is like kind of has these like old school, like Greco-Roman feeling to them. But yeah, at the same time, it's like it's hard to place a time era on them, and it really helps with the whole twist at the end of the film and everything.
Yeah,
everything about the film. It's a wonderful film. That's what it just comes down to.
Yeah, and it's making a lot of statements about a lot of different parts of society, more than just America and you know all that. It's making a statement about everything. And now I will just turn this very quickly, and there you go. There you go, everybody. So if you're wondering, that's what's hanging in the room. This is like my office room. That's what's hanging right there. And it even says Wednesday, April 3rd at a theater near you. So if you're wondering what day of the week April 3rd was in 1968, it was a Wednesday.
There you go.
So there it is. But yeah, I freaking love that poster. So got that hanging right there above everything. But anyway, John, what was the best movie you watched this week?
So I watched... It's spooky season. It's October. It's officially spooky season. And I started off with a pair of foreign vampire movies this weekend. Yesterday I watched A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which is an Iranian vampire movie. Gorgeous film. Absolutely phenomenal film. Has these Lynchian vibes to it. A little thin on the plot, but it was fun. But I do have to give it to the one I watched on Friday evening. I finally got around to watching Let the Right One In. What a terrifying, yet gorgeous, yet what a fantastic film.
I've never seen A Girl Walks Home at Night, and I really want to. I love Let the Right One In. And I will say one of the rare instances where the American remake is as good. Let Me In is a masterpiece because it doesn't pull any punches. It's got Chloe Grace Moretz and who's the boy in it?
Cody Smith McPhee.
Yeah, Cody Smith McPhee. That's what it is. It was like one of his first roles. Richard Jenkins is in it. It's a great movie. If you haven't checked it out, check out both of them though, because it's really interesting to see like the differences, but what can happen when you actually like make a good American movie. And just, because we're on the topic of it, it did happen to be written and directed by Matt Reeves, who did Cloverfield and also did Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and War for the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
So interesting to just point those two things out as well, because those were the second and third ones in the newest trilogy. And he also happened to make a really good remake of Let the Right One In.
Yeah, Let the Right One In. There are just moments in that film where I really enjoy the fact that it's focusing more on this like relationship between Oscar and Ely the entire film, rather than like on the horror elements. But then it like shocks you with those horror elements at the same time. The pool scene, fantastic.
The pool
Absolutely
scene's
fantastic.
Yeah.
The opening scene with the kid dangling upside down with his blood draining out and the dog just comes up. Oh, such a gorgeous shot. It very much feels like a Swedish movie in all the best ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also started spooky season a little bit. I watched The Mummy, the original Universal one, but that's definitely not my favorite movie I watched this week. I went through like I watched like Who's Your Next in Line of Succession movies. I watched The Lion in Winter and I watched Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Very different ways of looking at the Line of Succession. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was definitely my favorite though out of the ones that I watched. Paul Newman is great in it. Elizabeth Taylor really was iconic. Like, it's pretty unbelievable how good of an actress Elizabeth Taylor was. Her performance in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, I think, is like the greatest performance ever given by a woman. Maybe by anybody, but definitely by a woman. And she's very good in this too. It's a really interesting look at just like a family dynamic in the South. Whenever you can get that stuff, it's always, it can really work when it's in the hands of a talented writer, as it is in this instance. So Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was worth watching. The Lion in Winter has some good acting, but man, is that a weird movie.
That is one of my all-time favorite stage plays. I love The Lion in Winter.
Really? Because the pacing of the movie is like this, dude. It is like this, but there are some moments. Anthony Hopkins, I'm surprised didn't get an Oscar nomination for it. He's very good. Timothy Dalton's like 19 years old or something in the movie. He's very good. And then obviously Katharine Hepburn won the Oscar, and Peter O'Toole should have won the Oscar, ended up losing as he did every time in his career. So that's always fun. But speaking of Oscars and speaking of movies that, you know, really love Hollywood, John, let's talk about Birdman, or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance.
I tried to include the entire title, but StreamYard wouldn't let me. It was too long.
It's too long.
This movie caught me off guard. I knew about all the like hubbubaloo about it with the Oscars and everything. And I sat down one night. I was like, you know what? I've heard really good things about this movie. I didn't think I was going to love this movie as much as I did. And then I watched it again this week. And let's be real. We're at the top 25 movies in our top 100. It's hard for any of these movies to move up. And I'm sitting there thinking, I think Birdman moves up in my top 100. Like, this movie is so incredible. It's this scathing criticism of Hollywood and just actors in general and our society's approach to actors. It's filled with some of the most phenomenal performances in the last decade. They're so strong. Every single person in this movie is absolutely perfectly cast. I have this really soft spot for movies about stage productions. And this is by far the best film in that subgenre.
So I always loved Birdman. Birdman was the last cut when I was making my top 100. And I think it's going to knock some movies out, and it'll end up being in my next iteration of the top 100. I love this movie when I saw it. Came out in 2014, which is when I graduated from college. I'd not moved to Hollywood yet. I moved there in 2015. And so like I was, you know, still whatever. But I always just found this fascinating. First of all, the most fascinating thing about this movie is that it wasn't nominated for Best Film Editing. I just want to say that one more time. It was not nominated for Best Film Editing. If you watch this movie,
there are too few cuts in it. Is it he said there's too little editing in it?
Who knows? All I know is that you can barely tell where the cuts take place in this movie. And as far as I'm concerned, that should get you an auto win for film editing. That would be like not giving Sound of Metal best sound or, you know, whatever.
Well, I think there are 16 cuts in this film, and 13 of them come in the last sequence.
But still, there are cuts in this movie. They're just not noticeable cuts. Like, they didn't film a 2-hour movie over the course of 2 hours. This is filmed over the course of a 3-week period or whatever it is. There's plenty of cuts. You just can't tell where they are. That's great editing. So it's mind-blowing to me that there's no editing. It wasn't nominated for editing. But anyway, I love the screenplay to this, though. I was always a fan of Iñárritu. I love 21 Grams. I love Amores Perros. I think those are two really great movies. I finally got to watching Beautiful. So freaking depressing. Still really well done, but just too depressing for me, which is saying a lot because Iñárritu might be the most depressing director ever. If you watch Amores Perros and 21 Grams, 21 grams is the amount of weight you lose when you die. Okay, great. Moving on. But this movie, to me, was so accessible. And it made something accessible, too, that's not a very popular topic. stage productions in America, pretty much like this movie is saying, where washed up actors go to die, where they go to try to keep making money because they can't make money at the box office anymore. And because their name will have enough pull, they can bring people in. Obviously, you have your people who do it all the time, like Hugh Jackman, things like that, who aren't just doing it for the money. But at the same time, if Hugh Jackman's doing a one-man show, you're probably a lot more likely to go see it than if John Millsip is doing a one-man show, even if John Millsip's a better Broadway actor. So it's doing all of that as well. And then it gets into just the different characters you see along the way. Naomi Watts is notorious for hating Hollywood. She hates everything about it. That's why she hasn't won any awards, even though she should have. She just despises it. And that's also why she picks up the roles she does and doesn't get into these like bigger movies. Ed Norton is just known. He's pretty much playing himself in this movie. Yeah. Emma Stone wasn't well known enough to really like have a role there. But it's just getting into all the different people you run into while you're doing this. And it gets into their heads so well, of like the ones who are falling apart, the wife who was left behind, the daughter who's growing up with this absent father, and all these different forms of broken. And the pacing just flies, and it's very funny. There are so many hilarious moments in this movie. There's also the criticisms of just culture, how everything's becoming a social media culture, and how people don't have patience anymore, and how like, you know, there's a couple lines in there about you measure your success in weekends and things like that. Mm-hmm. Just everything. This was 2014 when we were really starting to see the shift from going to the movie theater to seeing a lot of stuff at home. And then Birdman ends up probably being one of the most criticized Best Picture winners of the last decade. But here's the reason. It had a very unfair list of movies it was going up against. It was going up the Grand Budapest Hotel, which Wes Anderson has his fanboys. Finally, Wes Anderson getting a Best Picture nomination. So there's that one. You have Boyhood. Richard Linklater finally gets his Best Picture nomination. And he filmed this over the course of like 20 years, whatever it was. That's going to get a lot of attention. You have American Sniper, which is Clint Eastwood. Everybody thinks it's going to be Clint Eastwood's last movie. Bradley Cooper playing the sniper. It's a war movie. It's Americana. So, of course, that is going to bring some attention. You have The Theory of Everything with Eddie Redmayne giving this crazy, ridiculous performance where he literally falls apart as a human. It's pretty unbelievable, even though Michael Keaton still should have won, and we'll talk about that. So that doesn't help. You have Whiplash, which is Whiplash. Like, that was such an unseen movie. You had Selma, which is about MLK, and was coming out in a time where racism was like at the forefront again in America. We were Obama. We were on the end of the Obama years. Obama was almost out of office, so America was kind of going through that, and Trump and Hillary was on its way. And then you had The Imitation Game, which is a fun movie, but it's a fun movie.
Feels like so different compared to the rest of the movies.
It does though, but that also helped it, and it's fun. It's got Keira Knightley, it's got Benedict Cumberbatch. It's a fun, like, solve the mystery kind of movie. So Birdman was kind of this pretentious FU movie that wasn't any of us, like in terms of like audience, that wasn't anybody's favorite movie out of those 8. And I think that's what hurt it. And that's why. And then Iñárritu is such a prick. And I mean that with absolute love. But when he goes up there and wins his Oscar, he pretty much is rubbing everybody's face in it. And he loves doing that. And I don't blame him because F it, man. He's from freaking Mexico. And he's like the first Mexican-American director to win all the awards like that. And so I get it. I totally get it because Alfonso Cuarón had won, but he had not won Best Picture yet. And Guillermo del Toro was going to come a couple years later. So Iñárritu is such an unlikable guy because he's so cocky, but I love that because he doesn't care. He won. Good. F you. I did it. And I love that about him. But I think that's why this movie was so criticized in the immediate aftermath, and why I think that now, almost 10 years later, this movie's not as discussed as maybe it really, though, John, it doesn't come up as a movie that shouldn't have won Best Picture when we hit Oscar season. And it doesn't really come up as one of the best Picture winners. It just kind of exists, which is very weird for a movie that came out in the last decade.
Yeah, it is really weird. And like, you think about it, like, this movie is probably it's going to be a cult classic. Mm-hmm. Despite being a Best Picture winner, it's going to be this movie that there are just these large, like these huge, this very vocal minority group who talks and praises this movie. But it's so good. Like,
Yeah, it is.
they're just every single moment in this movie, you're just so engaged. It brings you in. Inarritu has it's brilliant how he decided to make this film. The fact that it's shot with a ton of long takes. Apparently, during the filming process, Ed Norton and Michael Keaton would keep track of how many times everyone messed up their lines and made it so they had to retake or redo a take. And like Emma Stone did the most, which is understandable. She's the youngest person in this cast. And apparently Zach Galifianakis did the least amount. But that's because every time he messed up his lines, he did it so well, they just kept it in the film.
And there's a bunch. That one scene where he comes in and he says Scorsese instead of Scorsese, just left it. Just like, because he had butchered. I forget what the other word he messes up in that speech is, but he messes up another word. And then he says Scorsese instead of Scorsese. And they just kept that take because it worked. But that also helps. Zach Galifianakis raised in improv, whereas Emma Stone and the rest of these actors are more of dramatic actors. Zach Galifianakis very much a comedian, which is going to end up helping him in that sense, at least.
Yeah, it's so great. It's great that, like, I love that this movie kind of fits in our world, but doesn't fit in our world completely. Like, it has these references to these, like, when they're trying to find new actors. Fun fact, the Woody Harrelson line was actually supposed to be Philip Seymour Hoffman, but this was filmed like right after Philip Seymour Hoffman died. So they're like, we can't use that line anymore. So they're just like, well, Woody Harrelson's in the same movie, right? We can do that.
Yep.
And it's this idea of Birdman's so perfectly timed because it's right in that big Marvel boom. It's right after the Avengers. It mentions the Avengers with like Jeremy Renner and stuff, who we were talking about yesterday about being so much better in everything that he's not an action star in. And it very much seems like that's the case with the people who, like, it seems to be what any radio thinks too. But it's so perfect. Casting Michael Keaton in this role. A man who, Michael Keaton's career was practically dead when this movie came around.
It was gone.
It was gone. Like, he was, like, we're talking like B tier, like, horror movies he was starring in at this point. And this is a man who was a household name because of his performance in Batman, but people always associated with him with Batman. And we get him in this film, and this film completely showed how phenomenal an actor Michael Keaton really is. And that, like, you take these, and we know that now because we have this more reverence for, like, we respect superhero actors a lot more now. But, like, they were just a person in a cape, and they weren't just this popular thing because that's what those superhero movies were prior to the Marvel universe exploding and everything. And this movie just critiques them so well.
Yeah.
And Michael Keaton, like, having that rough, gravelly voice to, like, match Christian Bale's Dark Knight voice, fantastic. I love that this movie, there's so many questions you have about this movie of, like, wait, does Regan actually have superpowers? Is that a thing that's going on here?
Yep.
And
especially because how the ending is.
Yeah, and Inarritu starts the movie with him floating, and you're like, okay, is this really happening, or is this guy actually just, like, insane?
Yeah,
it's perfect. It gives you this, like, idea of an unreliable narrator in a movie that doesn't really have a narrator because it's so observational the entire time, and you're just watching everyone. Edward Norton comes in. That scene where Mike comes in and just starts reading lines with Regan, absolutely fantastic. That first introduction to Edward Norton in this film, it's great.
Why do you know all the? Wait, you know my lines too. Don't worry about how I know the lines. Don't worry about that. It's a thing I have. It's a gift.
And then we know everything about Regan from that scene and the scene that follows, where he's, like, undressed and he has his dick out in front of everyone.
Yeah.
And then Naomi Watts comes in and just criticizes Sam with her standing in the room. It's fantastic. It's just what theater is, and it's what all these people do. It's so well constructed, so well acted. I can't stop but being excited about this film.
Well, and it's like I always like when we were talking about Magnolia a couple weeks ago now, I always talk about the ambition of a movie. We'd seen stage type movies. It was only 4 years before this that we saw Black Swan. Now, Black Swan's a pretty damn ambitious movie. Let's not get carried away. But the ambition in Birdman, like Inarritu was known for these weird, like so many different characters. Babel is like 5 different characters, 6 different main characters, and Maurice Perros, 20 grams. It's all these different main characters, split timelines, things happen out of order so that it can kind of create the chaos, whatever it is. And he worked all the time with his writer, Guillermo Arriaga. I can never say Guillermo Arriaga, but he always worked with Guillermo Arriaga. And this was the first movie he did that didn't have Guillermo Arriaga attached to it. So it was like, well, what is he going to do to separate it from those other movies? Because those other movies are also very well received. I mean, Babel was a Best Picture nominee. And I think Beautiful, I don't remember if Inarritu wrote Beautiful or not, or if Arriaga did, but I do know for certain that Beautiful was the worst received out of all of those movies, at least at the time that it came out. So he had to do something unique and different and kind of show his real chops here. And to do this and to make such a statement, but say, we're going to do this as one take, almost showing off, like, look at the artistry that really can go into a Hollywood movie with A-list talent and everything when it is done correctly. Like, that can have a man in a cape and a mask and all of that, but have so much deeper of a meaning. The ending where he shoots off his nose and he's laying in bed with the mask on and he is now Birdman. Like, he is literally now Birdman. Like, all of those kinds of things. The moments with the critic where it's just ripping apart the critic. You have nothing to lose on this. One of my favorite scenes. I think it's brilliant. But all of that stuff just is so ambitious to pile this all into one movie. It's like when I was just talking about the Planet of the Apes, they saved some for the sequel. They didn't know how big of a hit it was going to be, whatever. Yeah. Birdman's just like, let's put it all in. It doesn't matter. Like, you just want to be immortal. That's all you care about. And you're worried, just like the rest of us, that you're going to die. That's what Emma Stone says to Michael Keaton in this movie. And it wraps up how every character in that movie feels, how Inarritu feels, that actors, directors, writers all feel. And it's kind of true. I mean, most artists want to be immortal. They want to be immortalized in some way, shape, or form. And this movie just nails it. And I will say, going back to the Oscar thing, this is, in my opinion, probably, well, and then The Shape of Water came out, so that didn't help. But what I loved so much about this movie winning Best Picture is, here's what came before it, right? The King's Speech, The Artist, Argo, 12 Years a Slave. It doesn't get any safer than that. Yeah. And then Birdman wins, beats The Theory of Everything, beats Boyhood, beats American Sniper, beats Selma. This was the weirdest movie at the time to ever win Best Picture. 3 years later, Shape of Water comes out and is so weird, but wins. But Spotlight the next year, Moonlight the year after that. Those are 2 movies that kind of go back to, like, this is what the Oscars always do. Birdman is the least Oscar baity movie, I think, ever. It is a movie that is just telling you everything it feels. It's putting it all out there. It doesn't care. It's in your face, loud, proud, wants you to like it, but wants you to think it doesn't care that you like it. And just like the actors and everybody who's in it. And I think it just nailed it. It just nailed it. When Birdman won Best Picture, that was the time where it was like, it was kind of like when Arcade Fire won Best Album at the Grammys for The Suburbs, where it's like, what? Who? Why did that happen? Like, you know what era we're in now, right? Like, that doesn't happen. That was Birdman. And, but it's so well executed. It really is just such a perfectly executed movie.
Yeah, and it has these gems of lines too in it. Something like, "You confused love for adoration." Mm-hmm. Oh, fantastic! Absolutely right, fantastic. I mean, speaking of this, like, love and adoration thing, Amy Ryan in this movie, also fantastic in this bit role.
Very small.
So small, so good. You could tell she cares so much about rigging, but like that they had this massive falling out. Fantastic. Naomi Watts' line, "Why don't I have any self-respect?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, just this
Because you're an
question that, like,
actress.
you're an actress, and, like, this
Yeah.
question that every single actor asks themselves at some point in their career. I mean, you already mentioned Emma Stone in her big speech to Reagan, where it's like, "Is it's not important. You're not important. Get used to it."
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the biggest things that like puts this movie into like existential terror segment is it's one of those moments where Reagan's really hearing Birdman, and he says, "Without me, all that's left is you."
Yeah.
And like that's that moment where like this movie really hits, I feel, because that's what it's saying. The problem is like the problem Regan Thompson has in this entire film is he is Birdman, and that is all that anyone recognizes him as. And he wants to be Regan Thompson.
Yep.
The reason he's doing this play, this specific play, is because of this childhood moment that he had, and it's so personal to him. To have everyone, to have like this critic be like, "Yeah, I'm going to tear your play apart. Doesn't matter because I just hate people like you, and I'm going to make it so no one goes to your show." It's
Well, and I
so
love
good.
the two. He tells the people about the napkin, and Ed
Yeah.
Norton goes, "It's written on a cocktail napkin. He was drunk." And then the next person he tells is the critic, and the critic says, "I don't care." Like I love that stuff because it really is just like, so I don't care. Now Raymond Carver, obviously, like, so if you ever seen Everything Must Go with Will Ferrell, that's Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver was pretty much known for just writing like everyday, ordinary people.
Mhm.
And doing so in kind of a depressing way. Like, what does Ed Norton say in this? Like, you should be leaving a piece. Of course, I'm drunk. You should be leaving a piece of your liver out on the stage every time because he left a piece of his liver in every page he wrote, or whatever it is, something like that. But that's what Raymond Carver was known for. And so it's interesting to have it be Raymond Carver, as you're saying, John. He just wants to be known as Regan Thompson, but he's not. So now he is trying to go to the exact extreme. And I think that's fascinating. It's the exact extreme of what Birdman is. Birdman is the extreme of Hollywood explosions. We're going to make money and I'm going to become famous forever. And then Raymond Carver is, I just want to be the ordinary person. Raymond Carver, if you read any of his short stories, they are all, they begin and they end. And then you have to sit there and think about, what did I just read? The movie Shortcuts that Robert Altman made, which is pretty much the inspiration for Magnolia, was all based off of Shortcuts by Raymond Carver, which was a collection of short stories. Like, so to choose Raymond Carver out of anybody you could have chosen, and then make the play, what do we talk about when we talk about love? Because Regan Thompson feels that there is no love. He has nothing. He has nothing. He doesn't have the adoration of the fans anymore because they've moved on. He doesn't have his wife. He's losing his daughter. He doesn't feel like anybody respects him. He doesn't even know how to use Twitter or anything like that. He's falling apart. And so he has to make this play. What do we talk about when we talk about love? It's the layers, the ambition. It's all there. And that's just, man, when Iñárritu made this and then followed it up with The Revenant the next year, the man was just on a different level.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually really interesting. Like you started talking about like ordinary people and Raymond Carver talking about ordinary people. Did you know there's a connection with Ordinary People and Birdman? Like the film Ordinary People and Birdman?
No.
Birdman is the first Best Picture winner since Ordinary People not to get a Best Editing nomination.
How about that? And I'm going to be honest with you, Ordinary People didn't really need one. Birdman should have gotten it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we've kind of mentioned this editing aspect a couple of times, and like obviously the film was shot to resemble Russian art and like to seem like this big one take. Obviously, it's not. It takes place over multiple days and everything, but Iñárritu hides these cuts, and like I said, there is a sequence at the end of this film after Regan shoots his nose off that has 13 cuts in it, of the 16 visible cuts in this film.
Yeah.
And the other ones are just obscured in darkness. The cuts are, I think, one of the big cuts is right before the Truth or Dare scene on the rooftop. As it gets really dark, there's a cut right before that door opens.
Yeah, that's it.
You can barely make it out if you're paying enough attention. But like, that's the genius of the editing of this film, and it is absurd that it wasn't nominated for best editing because of that.
It's like people couldn't see it. And then speaking of things that people couldn't see, Michael Keaton doesn't win the Oscar and loses to Eddie Redmayne. Now, I'm not saying Eddie Redmayne didn't give a phenomenal performance. Eddie Redmayne gives a phenomenal performance as Stephen Hawking. There's no doubt about it. But I say this every time. Actors should be able to play a real life person that they're mimicking, really, no matter who that real life person is. I understand this is different. To play the role of somebody who's going through ALS and pretty much it's such a physical performance. But I compare this situation, and if you think about the movies, they're so similar to when Mickey Rourke lost to Sean Penn for Sean Penn playing Harvey Milk. Mickey Rourke plays the wrestler, up and coming, or, like a comeback movie, comeback role, all of that stuff. Mickey Rourke gives the much better performance, but it's subtle, so he loses. Eddie Redmayne's performance is so in your face, and it has to be. I mean, we all know Eddie Redmayne is a perfectly able-bodied person. But what Michael Keaton does in this movie is so impressive. And I always look at it as like, everybody, and unless you've actually been around like an actor or seen that switch flip, it's kind of hard to really understand what sets a good actor apart from a bad one. Because like if I sat down in front of a camera, I could probably pound out a couple lines and everybody be like, okay, he's not very good, but like whatever. But it's the, when you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden they just flip that switch and you're like, how did they do that? And the scene where Michael Keaton tricks Edward Norton and makes him think, my father was an alcoholic. He used to beat the shit out. He'd come home and do this. And Ed Norton finally loses and he looks at me and goes, and it's all a lie. I can act too, or whatever he said. It's like, he's not just going from Michael Keaton to the character of Regan Thompson. He's then going from Regan Thompson to an actor pretending to do that back to Regan Thompson. That is so hard to do. There's so many layers to that. I don't know, man. Like, it's just such a raw performance. It's just so well done. I just love it. I love the performance.
Well, and I mean, while we're speaking performances, any other year, Ed Norton wins Best Supporting Actor for this role too, right?
Yeah, J.K. Simmons is just, he was too good.
He was. I mean, we've already talked about it. It's one of the best supporting actor performances ever in Whiplash. But Edward Norton playing this parody of himself in this film, because anyone who's like kind of in tune with like Edward Norton at all knows that like these are complaints levied against Edward Norton all the time. He is this massive dick. All he does is like critique everything. He gives directors advice on how things should be done the entire time. And like even during the filming, there was a point where apparently Norton did this to Inarritu, and Inarritu's like, yeah, you're supposed to be out of character now.
Yeah, because the method acting too was another thing. Like Ed Norton known as being a method actor and everything. And so that's why he's saying, don't call me whatever, I'm Mike, I'm not whoever else. Like, so many great moments with Edward Norton, and Edward Norton probably would have won. Emma Stone also probably wins if Patricia Arquette isn't in Boyhood, and I think Patricia Arquette's good in Boyhood for sure. But I do think that she won because Boyhood really wasn't winning anything else that year, and so I think that was kind of why it ended up where she ended up taking home that one, because Linklater and Boyhood, with as ambitious as that movie was, weren't getting anything. They didn't get any other Oscars except for Patricia Arquette, so that was kind of the one that they had to give it to. And then Emma Stone comes out and wins Best Actress 2 years later when she's. It's funny how what this movie did for a lot of people though, because Inarritu the next year does The Revenant, wins director, but loses Best Picture to Spotlight, which stars Michael Keaton.
Yeah.
Who's fully in the comeback now, and 2 Best Picture winners in a row. Who would have picked that in the 90s? And then you had Emma Stone, who really this was her like breakout performance. Like she had been in Easy A and she had done Super Bad, and she was a good actress. But this was like her whole man, she can act. And I prefer her in this to La La Land without a doubt. I think she's very good in La La Land, but I prefer her in this for sure. But you're just not going to beat Patricia Arquette for Boyhood in this one. And she goes on to win the Oscar 2 years later. But this movie really did kind of like open it up for some people for even a short period of time, just to make things happen for them. But just such an incredibly well made movie, just artistic and just so artfully made. And I don't really know how else to say that, but that's just what I come to with this movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's scathing. I understand why people wouldn't like this movie. It's a pretty like it's not a nice movie. It's a
Yeah.
very heavy, super critical movie. I understand people don't like this type of movie when they go to a movie. I understand there are people who like the escapism of films, and this is far too real.
Mhm.
But I love this. I love how angry and hate-filled this movie is.
Yeah, I mean, Inarritu's an acquired taste for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
His movies are depressing, they're dark, they bounce all over the place. They have these grand statements. They're in your face. I mean, he does not make happy movies. This is a really funny movie, but it's not a happy movie. The Revenant is not a happy movie, and none of his movies are happy. But he just has such command. He has such command, and I think that's why he's one of the best living directors there is, and that's why this movie's gonna end up in my top 100 for sure. Still think I prefer The Revenant, but I'm not sure. I don't know. They're so 1A and 1B for me. They just hit me in such different ways. And to think about that, though, you make Birdman in 2014. The next year, you make The Revenant. It's crazy enough that you made those two movies in back-to-back years, but they're so opposite each other, and yet they have equal ambition. How do you do that? How do you do that?
Do you know Birdman was only made in 2014 because of a scheduling conflict for Leonardo DiCaprio?
That's funny.
They were supposed to make The Revenant this year, but they're like, oh, we have like 3 months. Let's make Birdman.
Birdman never wins Best Picture the next year if The Revenant comes out first.
No.
Birdman never wins Best Picture. That's crazy. I didn't know that. That's good. That's good info, John. Look at you, movie buff specialist over here. He's a specialist. He knows things. You have anything else you want to say about these, or should we wrap this up?
No. These we're at a point now where every single movie we say or we talk about for the last stretch here, watch them. Watch them if you haven't watched them. Watch them again if you have watched them.
Yeah. Well, next week we're moving on to our number 24, and we're going to be talking about The Shining for John, which is also on my list, but higher up or lower down, I guess you would say, and Swingers for me from 1996 with Vince Vaughn and Jon Favreau. So Swingers from 1996 and The Shining from 1980, which was a Razzie winner for being bad. Just don't ever forget it.
Yep.
But we'll be doing that next week, and then we're probably going to take a week or two off as I do nothing but watch movies, but also recover. So we'll be doing that, and we'll probably get that one the end of this week or this weekend at some point. I don't know. We'll figure it out, but keep an eye out for that one. That's what's going to be coming in. Appreciate you all listening, and we'll see you next time.